Welcome, everyone. I know that some of you weren't able to make it last week. Glad to have you here this week. What I did last week, obviously, was review the objective logic stuff, all of that, and then how that led into the subjective logic. So that's what we did last week. What I'm going to do today is open by trying to look at some questions that we had that were raised in that transition for just a moment. I want to talk about three questions as a way of leading us into the project of the subjective logic itself. So we'll talk about what's this volume of the book supposed to try to do, how does it try to do it, and we'll talk about some things preliminarily because it'll be like an overview of why there's a subjectivity, objectivity idea, section division set up for this particular volume. And we'll want to come back and revisit that continually as we go through it, obviously. So if you feel a little unsure about how things go in the initial layout of those three sections, you're okay, because we're going to come back and sort of remind ourselves each time as we move from subjectivity to objectivity into the idea, what was supposed to happen in the subjectivity chapter according to the division, and then how that moves into objectivity and so forth, and so on from there. So, but I do think we need an initial layout of it. That's what I'll do today. And then we'll spend the majority of our time looking at this universality, particularity, individuality thing. The most common thing that people get out of this, so let me just go ahead and sort of set this in place. You know why I'm doing this, it's to call it into question. So, but a very simple way that people often take the message of what's going on with this, they'll say, oh, well, essence is the truth of being, and the truth of essence is the concept. So the concept is really significant and important in Hegel. Right, good. So what is the concept? Well, it's universality, particularity, individuality, or universality, particularity, singularity. I'll use those terms. Einzelheit is the German. Sometimes it gets translated individuality. Sometimes it gets translated as singularity. It just depends on what you're trying to emphasize, really. Individualität is a German term as well, so you could use that. But Hegel selected this term. We'll talk about it. But anyway, so just be aware. Sometimes I'll say individuality. Sometimes I'll say singularity. I kind of go back and forth. Di Giovanni, I think, does singularity most of the time, but he does also individuality. So we'll talk about that. But people often take away from that. They'll go, oh, well, that's what the concept is. The concept is universality, particularity, individuality. And what that means is this, that there's this thing called the concept, and it's a universal. And it gets particularized. And what that means is it gets materially actualized in some way. And that gets realized as individuals. Sort of like any concept of chair, my favorite example, gets particularized, that particular chair, and then becomes, with particular cloth on it, particular material it's made out of, so that's its particularization, and then it gets instantiated as an individual, that particular chair, this chair, that chair. What Aristotle calls a tota ti, right? This thing here. That's not what Hegel's talking about, right? If you got nothing else out of the torturous readings, right, and I admit that they're torturous, the subsumptive model of the concept that I just elaborated, right, that there's some abstract thing called a concept that somehow or another gets particularized because of, materiality of some kind or another, and then gets individuated. That's just literally not, that subsumptive model is precisely what Hegel is not talking about with the concept. So what is he talking about with the concept? Very important to try to understand. This universality, particularity, individuality thing, this term logic, is the way we can think about it, which is going to give rise to the judgment and to syllogism. So we're not done with this stuff, these terms, universality, particularity, individuality. Just because he's talked about it once, he's going to talk about it again in judgment for a particular reason. He's going to come back and talk about it again for a further reason in syllogism. Right? His ultimate claim is that if you want to understand the nature of the concept, you need to understand the nature of syllogisms. This is his claim. Right? That's the fullest, most determinate structural account of the movement of the concept that there is. Right? So he at one point says, and he doesn't mean this metaphorically, he means this literally, that everything is a syllogism. He does not mean that as everything's like a syllogism or everything is syllogistic kinda, or you can make syllogism. He literally thinks that everything that exists by virtue of a process, and that process is elaborated best in terms of syllogism. Now, let's just go ahead and acknowledge, I've said many times last quarter, that's preposterous, right? That's nuts. that's ludicrous. How could anyone think that? How could that make sense at all? But that's precisely what Hegel thinks, and we'll have to see why he thinks that and what that means for him. And then we're going to have to make sense of this. This will get us to this, why do we move from subjectivity to objectivity to idea stuff. He thinks because that's the case, not in spite of it, but because everything is a syllogism, that necessarily syllogisms are objectivity. They're objective. They are the world. They are the world. Right? They are literally the nature of reality itself. So that's why we have to move to objectivity. So we'll talk more about this as we get there, but I just want to be clear about the stakes that we're operating with at this point. This isn't a metaphorical claim. I think the best way to read Hegel, as I've tried to substantiate last quarter, we'll do again this quarter as we already started this, is metaphysically, ontologically. I think that's what he's doing, even with this strange stuff on concept, judgment, and syllogism. Right? So what would be broadly called formal logic at the time, right? Sort of the standard formal logic of the time. It's not our formal logic today. We live in a post-Fregean world that's worried about predicate logic, propositional logic, not term logic. But Hegel thinks there's a reason why we should be talking about term logic. I'll speak about that in just a second. But this is what's at stake there. This is the philosophical and metaphysical stakes of it. All right. Make a little bit of sense? Not a lot right now, that's okay. Makes a little bit of sense. So what I want to do is take up three questions. I think these are all, they're not the only ones, but they're fundamental questions about the nature of the subjective logic. They go to the very heart, as far as I can tell, of the project, what I'll call the project of the subjective logic. What is Hegel trying to do? What does he see himself as trying to accomplish in this volume over against what he's already accomplished in the objective logic? So what is this following on from that, being entailed by that? What is its task over against the tasks that we saw in the objective logic? So three questions. One we talked a little bit about last time because it was raised last time, but it's this question. Why do we begin the subjective logic? Why do we begin the subjective logic with a section, you read the first chapter of it today, with a section devoted to subjectivity? Subjectivity. What does this term, subjectivity, even mean in the context of the science of logic? What does subjectivity mean here? What's it doing here? Right? What's going on? Just so that. Second question. Why must formal logic, that is, as I said, the term logic, not the predicate logic, so basically the Aristotelian inheritance of logic, it's not completely Aristotle, but it's a scholasticized version of Aristotle. It's inherited by, Wolff is the one who really puts this together in the way that it's used. Kant elaborates it. It's the structure of the first critique, right? It's all over that. So it's concept, judgment, syllogism. Why does that logic, the logical concept, judgment, and syllogism, why are those set of formal categories and structures, why are they the ones that articulate best the immanent logic of the generative process of manifestation, which is Hegel's claim, right? If you want to know what the process of manifestation is, if you want to know how everything comes to be as it is and what it is, then you need to look at the concept, and to know the concept you need to know its immanent transformative flow, its immanent generative flow, and the way, and that's not arbitrary. So the rules that govern that process are the rules that are elaborated by formal logic, but term logic. But why? Why that? Why not some other logic that goes some other place, or a logic that is wholly unique to it? Why these rules of thought, which is what these are? Hegel knows that. He's not ignorant of that tradition. He well knows that these are the rules of reasoning. Concept formation, put concepts together into judgments, put judgments together into syllogisms. That's how you reason. These are the rules for doing that. Aristotle begins this. He gets transformed in the medieval period. Wolff is the key inheritor in Germany, in the German legacy. But why that? Why that? So that's the second question. So the first one is just why subjectivity. Second one is why the formal logic. Then the third question, what can this logic, that term logic, tell us about the immanent structure of the process of manifestation? What can it tell us about? Why must it be what we use to get there? But then, if it is, what does it tell us? What does it have to give us? So those are three questions I think go to the very heart of the project of the subjective logic. Other questions to be asked here, of course, but let me focus on those three for just a moment. So what I propose is to address the first question, Why subjectivity? By way of an examination of the second, the necessity of the term logic. And then this will lead us finally to the most important question, namely, what contribution does the term logic of subjectivity make to the account of the generative process of the concept? That is the question that we began pursuing in our last session with our discussion of the concept and its determinations, right? As we started saying, well, the concept is the third, the concept is self-consciousness, all those polemical definitions. I'll come back to one of those polemical definitions in just a moment. So why must formal logic, that is the term logic of concept, judgment, and syllogism, be the set of formal categories and structures that articulate the immanent logic of the generative process of manifestation? So let's deal with that second question. So to answer that question, we need to return to the demonstration. Sorry, we're going to go back there one more time. To the demonstration that Hegel offers at the end of the objective logic, specifically the transition there, the last paragraph, from actuality to concept. So consider first the central thesis of that transition. Hegel's claim is that in reciprocity, that's the last category of the objective logic, in reciprocity, causation, the content of manifestation itself, the causal power, is shown to be the concept. That's the crucial move, right? That the causal power, the causality itself, the causal process is the process of the concept. The category of manifestation refers to the generative process that constitutes both being, that is what is, and essence, the whatness of what is, actuality and possibility, substance and accident, cause and effect. The form of that manifestation is absolute necessity, as we know. As Hegel says on page 487, this is 391, the German, it is, whatever is, therefore, because it is, right? It just is because it is. That's the absolute necessity of things. That's its form, its modality, its mode. The content of manifestation is the absolute relation. This is the actuosity, as he calls it at one point, the accidentality of substance, the Mach, right, the power. The causation that in producing its effect produces its own cause. There's the weird claim, right? This is a cause that produces itself, better said, this is a causal process that engenders its own cause by engendering its effect. So there's the notion of reciprocity, right? We tend to think of reciprocity as all things are in thoroughgoing reciprocal relation to one another. That's the way Kant defines it, for example. This is the, if you want to reconstruct this, go back to Kant and look at the categories in Kant. This is what Hegel's clearly drawing from. He's not reciting those, but he's pulling on those quality, relation, modality. If you look at the one under relation, reciprocity, the third one, he says everything is in thoroughgoing reciprocal relation with one another. Where Hegel ups the ante on that and says everything is thoroughgoing relationship to itself because it engenders itself. So this is the argument he had made there. It's not one thing causes another thing. Things are not in causal relationship to each other. That's almost secondarily true. Things are generated by themselves. There is a causal process, one causal process, that engenders everything that is, and it causes itself. It literally is self-causative. Therefore, it is self-generative, free. So as reciprocal causation, the process of manifestation differentiates itself into the self-related substance, what he calls the passive substance there, which we call the cause. And Hegel says that's the universal moment. And the negativity identical with itself, he calls this the active substance, that's the effect. He calls this the individual or the singular, so there's universality and individual. And then he says the simple identity that constitutes the determinateness of the singular, the effect, and thereby constitutes the self-relation of the universal, that is the cause, is particularity. So particularity is the name for it. It designates somehow or another the differentiating moment of the process itself. Now, in a nutshell, that'll be the problem we're going to be obsessed with, that Hegel's obsessed with, throughout the rest of the subjective logic, is how do you understand universality is nothing other than particularization. That's all it is. Right? There is nothing really unto, we'll give an austere, minimal definition of universality in just a little bit, as Hegel does in that discussion of it. It means nothing other than self-related self-sameness. That's all it is. Bare self-relatedness, bare self-sameness. There's no content to it. Not as universal. Now we'll get to where it generates its own content in just a moment, but it doesn't have any content, at least at that moment. Where does the content come from? It comes from particularization, which is not something separable from universality. That's what we just heard. right? The causal process is not cause or effect, it's the causal process itself that engenders the universal, the cause, and the individual, the effect. So, put crudely, I apologize for the crudeness of this, the action is in particularization. That's where the differentiation process is going on. That's where determinate negation is occurring. Everything else is an after effect. I don't like that term so much here, but it is something that's engendered by that process and that process alone. So initially, going into the subjective logic, you might think, oh, as I just said, particularization is where it's at. I think that's true. I don't think that's wrong to say. Right? But the argument of the subjective logic is going to be that universality just is differentiation, just is particularization. And that's going to demand us to rethink universality. Now, this is his point about the concept. This is the core point about the concept in general. The way we standardly think of the concept is as an abstract universal. We think of it either as something, as a property that is shared by a bunch, kind of a nominalist view of deflationary conception of universality. We think of it, oh, well, a bunch of things have this in common, this feature, this property in common. We think of that as their universality. There's no universals, right? This is sort of the Occam's moment, right? There's no universals. But yeah, there are things that lots of things share, like these tables are all made of wood, well, whatever they're made out of. Let's say they're all made out of wood. So they share that property in common. But there's no wood concept extractable from them. There's just that property they share. That's one way in which we tend to understand universality, is just a shared common property, what Kant called a common representation. Now, Kant would take it one step further. He would say, well, it's not just a property they all share, right? It's they're all members, all these things called wooden tables, are members of this thing we call the class of wood, or the class of table. So we would think of universality as a class concept. That's the way in which Kant, when he says that universals are common representations, that's what he really means by it. He means they're classes. This is what a category is for Kant, right? They're subsumptive in that sense, right? You take things under them. They're instantiations of them. They subsume individuals or particulars under them as their own instantiations. This is as old as Plato, if not before. Right? This is the standard way in which we think about categories, concepts, universals. Hegel's point in the subjective logic is that that's not what the concept is. The concept is not a subsumptive, abstract universal, either in the sense of a shared property. That's there, that'll work, that's out there, I understand that, but that's not what he means by a universal. He doesn't mean by a universal a class. Those are out there, those are appropriate, we can talk about those. He's not invalidating them. He's not saying you can't talk about the class of these things. But if that's what you think a concept is, that's what you think universality is, you're mistaken. Because universality just is particularization, then you're going to have to think universality as engendering its own determinacy, which common property conception of universality does not do, and which the class conception of universality does not do. So universality has to engender its own determinations. It's kind of have to engender its own determinations. He's already starting this in the discussion of universality in the first chapter that you've seen here. I'll try to point this out. That's what the discussion of particularization is, both totality and principle is about, right? So that's a weird thing for him to introduce there. What does he mean by totality? What does he mean by principle? But those are both ways, as far as I can tell, for him to say universality is not an empty, vacuous thing. It's not a class concept. It's not a common. It's not a common property concept. It is, in fact, engendering of its own content. Engendering of its own content. So he says, this is back on 505, still in that last paragraph in the objective logic. He says, these three totalities, he's talking about universality, particularity, singularity, universality, particularity, individuality, are therefore one and the same reflection. Now he has more to say, and I want to look at that, but it's good to stop there for just a moment and realize that's the point he's continually going to be making. Look at what he has to say about individuality. He defines it in a double sense too, right? He says it's the completion, it's what he calls the turning around, right? The Rückkehr, it comes back to itself, right? Universality completes itself in individuality. but it's also the loss, the Verlust. It loses itself at that same time. So he's constantly saying, you've got to think these three together. There are, he says, moments of one and the same reflection, is the way he puts it back on 505. He's not going to diverge from that. They're always to be thought of together. They're ineliminable for one another, and they have to be thought of in this twofold way, which we'll try to elaborate in just a moment. He says, going back to the quote on 505, this is 409 in the German, these three totalities are therefore one and the same reflection that as negative relation to itself, that's the moment of particularization, differentiates itself into both of the other two totalities, into universality, into individuality, but as in a completely transparent difference. Particularization doesn't, so to speak, throw them off and let them exist on their own. It's always a whole, to be thought of as a whole, a flow that belongs together. So it differentiates itself into both of the other totalities, but in a completely transparent difference, namely into determinate simplicity. Determinate simplicity is universality. Or into simple determinateness, he likes to flip that, right? Determinate simplicity, or simple determinateness, which is singularity, which is their one and the same identity. Can't think one without the other, have to think all three together. Particularity, at least initially, looks to be where all the work's getting done. That's precisely the way he presents it at the end of the objective logic. What we're going to find out in the subjective logic is, that has implications for how you think universality itself, and therefore for how you think individuality, how you think all three. He then says, this is the last line of the objective logic, this is the concept, so he just says, that process I just laid out of universality being particularized and thereby being individuality. This is the concept, the realm of, as he calls it here, of subjectivity or freedom. I tried to give some account of why I think he can use the term freedom there. He will come back to it. You'll see him already refer to it as the free concept here. You need to hear freedom each time there as self-causative, right? Self-causative, self-engendering, self-causative. So the realm of subjectivity is what we're going to try to figure out. Why is he using that term, subjectivity? What kind of subjectivity are we talking about here? So manifestation qua reciprocity is therefore the concept, because the determinations of the concept, universality, particularity, and individuality, define the process of generation imminently and exhaustively as self-referential. That's in terms of the form, their absolute necessity, it is because it is, and self-determining, that's the content, so there's freedom. So it follows from this that the basic determinations of the concept of conceptuality itself, we could say, that is, again, universality, particularity, singularity, have shown themselves to be the moments that mark out, that is, determine the process of manifestation that being itself has proven by virtue of its imminent and necessary and lengthy unfolding, it's shown itself to be. So another way of reminding yourself of this, I've said this before, nothing new in this, but it's worth, I think, repeating here, is that the entirety of the objective logic is an argument for two claims. The entirety of the objective, there's more claims there than this, but two main claims that you want to cash out and get worked on in the subjective logic. One is that everything is relational. Everything is in thoroughgoing reciprocal relation with one another. And two, all of those relations are engendered by a process that's self-causative. So relationality entails process. It's its own generative process. But what's not been laid out yet is that logic of that process itself. We've got the logic of all those relations, my God. I mean, we've got those aplenty. But what we don't have is an account of the process itself. Hegel's claim on that last paragraph, that last page, is that universality, particularity, individuality is the logic endemic to that process itself. The subjective logic is the payoff now of what does that mean? So the determinations of the concept and all that follow from it, namely as we shall see the determinations of judgment and the determinations of syllogism, have shown themselves to be what, or will show themselves to be properly, they are properly what name the determinations of the movement of manifestation. So just remind yourself what Hegel means by manifestation. It's not the manifestation of something. There's not something that's being manifested. There's not some thing, call it substance or God or whatever. It's being displayed, being revealed. No, he says, this is on 478 in the English, this is 381 in the German. The actual is therefore a manifestation. The actual just is this process called manifestation. And then he says, just to emphasize what I've just said, it is not, manifestation, is not drawn into the sphere of alteration by its externality. That's the account we saw in the logic of being, right? That everything is moved out beyond itself by its relationship to that which is external to it. The same in the other, right? The thing in this other. So that's alteration. Things are constantly being altered. So it's not like that. Nor is it the shining of itself in another, which is the account in essence, right? Essence shines in something other than itself. It shines in existence. Existence is related, reflected back into, shining into essence. It says it's not that either. Rather what? Actuality has proven itself to be this. It manifests itself, which means that in its externality and externalizing itself, it is itself and only in it. That last clause I think is incredibly important, right? There is nothing other than manifestation. There's nothing being displayed. The display is everything. The manifestation is everything. That is to say, it is itself only as, now just emphasizing this point we've been at several times, it is itself only as self-differentiating and self-determining movement. So, as I said in our session from last week, if you asked Hegel, do you give us a monism? He would say, yeah. Do you give us a monism of being? Absolutely. Well, on your account, what is being? The concept. Oh, so it's some large, empty, vacuous class of all things. Hell no. It's a process, the process of manifestation. Oh, well, it's the manifestation of some being. Mm-mm. At the foundation of all things, to use very general terms, right? The foundation of all things is a process. Nothing more, nothing less. The cheap way of putting this is Heraclitus is right. Everything is constantly becoming. Right? So that first bit about being nothing becoming proved out to be that being is becoming. That turned out to be true all the way through. But now becoming just engenders literally everything that it is, and it has a logic to itself. It's called manifestation, and now we're trying to figure out the logic of that itself. So manifestation necessarily entails the concept. That's the quick summation of the objective logic. And thus all the determinations that follow from it. So I'm just trying to keep the continuity of the argumentation together. We took a month off, let's just remind ourselves, right? So manifestation entails concept, and then where does that go? Well, it goes to the stuff you read this week, the concept as it's called, but then into judgment and syllogism, because those aren't, free add-ons, so to speak. Those aren't things that go along with it. Those are necessarily entailed by it and are further and more deeper determinations of the concept itself. So why do we begin the subjective logic with a section devoted to subjectivity? This looks strange. You've all of a sudden, at the end of the objective logic, where we were talking about, necessity, possibility, contingency, modality terms, and we were talking about substance and accidents and cause and effect and reciprocity, reciprocal determination, all that kind of stuff, which is causal terms. None of that seemed to have anything to do with, let's just use a loaded term for a moment, agency, which is what we normally associate with a term like subjectivity. So why call this a subjective logic? Why begin the first section of the subjective logic with a section entitled subjectivity? And then the second section is on objectivity, and what's all that? So as we know, subjectivity here can't mean the phenomenological distinction between consciousness and the world that it encounters. It can't be that. Why not? It can't be the traditional subject-object divide, as we would say, the mind-world problem. It can't be that. Why? Because that distinction, that division, that separation, the phenomenological problematic, was already worked over, worked through, and shown to be ultimately grounded in the oneness of thought and being and absolute knowing in the phenomenology. So it's not like we reverted back to the phenomenology and say, okay, we've been doing ontology, now we're going to do a phenomenology. No. So subjectivity is not phenomenological awareness of the world. It's not consciousness. Okay, fine, that's what it's not. We also know it can't be that because if we take that route in, the phenomenology route in, we know from the with what must the science of logic begin, we know that's the mediated route in, right? But we could have taken the immediate route. We could have said, suspend all presuppositions. Let go of all vestiges of prevailing presuppositions and commitments. Well, one of those that's got to go is the subject-object divide. So it can't all of a sudden show up again here. So none of that can be what subjectivity means here. At least it doesn't seem to be. So what then is the subjectivity that is set forth across the accounts of, so this first chapter, concept, judgment, and syllogism? We'll get to why is the whole thing called the subjective logic later, but for now, let's just deal with why is the first chapter of subjectivity? What could that possibly mean? Why is the last sentence of the objective logic say, that's the concept, which is the realm of freedom from subjectivity? So let's start with somewhat commonsensical claim. Ken, did you have a question?
A couple, but I'll start with this one just because it's
Yeah.
to what you just said.
Yeah.
So I would ask, why does the methodological import of what does logic begin and why we can't take the mediated route, does that necessitate that some sort of phenomenological subject-mind divide or subject-object divide wouldn't appear later in the logic? Exclusive, I guess.
It can appear unless it's justified as such, right? So it can't, let's say it more broadly, because you said in the logic, it can appear in the system more broadly, which is really what we're talking about there, right? That's the beginning of the system. So it can't appear in the system unless it's justified as entailed as such. So, you could ask back to me at that point, well, that's what's happening here, right? Maybe this is precisely the moment already in the logic. We don't have to wait to the subjective spirit section, philosophy of spirit, subjective spirit section, where he talks about consciousness and awareness. Again, not from a phenomenological perspective, from a systematic perspective, but at least we're talking about the divide at that point. You say, well, no, I'm not attributing this to you, but you could say, well, he's doing it here, that's why we've gotten to it. But I don't think that's legitimated because this isn't an account of the relationship between consciousness and its object. So that would be infusing too much into subjectivity here. So what I want to do is try to look at how Hegel actually uses the term subjectivity here and what it means for him contextually in this particular section without infusing it with all the stuff that we know are probably not candidates for its meaning. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
You had another.
Yes, but I don't know if it's about differentiation. But
You can go ahead and put it on the table, at least.
So I guess this is looking at differentiation here versus the way it appears in the doctrine of essence. So, but in the objective logic. So differentiation here is either it's universality particularizing itself, or it's particularization into universality and individuality. It depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
So
Those are equivalent things. We'll see why they're equivalent later, but yes.
So we can see this as a higher determination, or maybe not the final account, but a more final account of what differentiation looks like for Hegel. So I was wondering, does this bear any ontologically significant difference that's problematic? Any ontologically significant distinction between the way differentiation happens in the account of diversity, between absolute difference and absolute identity?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is yes. Because the way we got to diversity so I'll be very brief about this, but I think it's an important question. Hegel's going to continually do this comparison, right? He'll say, we're talking about particularization here, we're talking about differentiation here, whatever. And he'll go back and do quick comparisons and say, this is different than the way we did it in the logic of being, different than the way we did it in the logic of essence. But it's only, at most a sentence, sometimes just a clause where he does those kinds of comparisons. And you don't know how much to hang on them, you don't know what the import of that necessarily is. But I think summarily, if you put them all together, they mean something like this, pointedly to your question about specifically diversity, which he'll come back to several times here and use that term in particular, so pointing out that particular category, is that in the logic of differentiation that we have in the logic of essence, what we have there is a diversity that arises from the givenness of existence. It just is there. And then we can see that abstracted from that, you can find lightness and unlightness, and then you can find identity and difference from that, and then you can say, oh, well, the essence stands over against the identity, or over against the difference, but the difference has to then be contradiction, because the identity, we know the story, right? It can't be what it is, it has to be other than what it is, and therefore every identity is busted apart, broken inherently from itself and necessarily appears. That's a very quick summation of much more careful, rigorous argumentation that he does. But note there that diversity is a kind of, let me use this term cautiously, a given. It arises because it's a feature of existence that would have to be accounted for by the logic of being, right? So it has to be accounted for by the nodal logic, the nodal lines of things changing and transforming. That's the diversity of things. Things are different than one another. No two blades of grass are the same, says Leibniz, right? This is diversity, the principle of diversity. And Hegel's picking up on that and saying, oh, well, then where do we get identities? Well, we find likenesses. Through comparisons, we can find likenesses and so forth and so on there. But notice that Verschiedenheit, diversity, is given. I think this is the key notion in the logic of essence. It's not given here. It's produced. And what this is supposed to be, what we're about to look at, is to be an account of how do you get differences. Not just that there are differences, which is what you do, what you deal with, what you grapple with over against essence over against the identity of essence in the logic of essence. Here, we have to give an account of, well, where does differentiation come from? Right? Why are two blades of grass not the same? Right? What is it about the nature of manifestation, about this process, about the concept, that engenders, produces, causes, creates those kinds of differences? And that means that, as far as Hegel claimed, it can't just be a feature of the world. You can't just say, look, there's a blooming, buzzing confusion, to use Kant's language for this, and just say, it's all craziness out there, right? We have to make some sense of it, so how do we make sense of it? We bring it under the categories, to use the Kantian, broad Kantian framework. I'm butchering Kant by saying these things, but don't tell Avery and we'll be okay. But Hegel wants to say, differences isn't just out there. And then we have to figure out how does it get, let me use a loaded term, subsumed under the oneness of the concept. We have to think about how the concept engenders, produces, creates differentiation itself. So we need to know the logic of that differentiation. So I would say, long-winded answer to a much more pointed question, that in the subjective logic you get an account of the immanent differentiation of the concept. And you see that the concept just is that logic of immanent differentiation itself. I mean, the problem we're going to have coming out of the subjective logic, just to anticipate where things go, is you'll want to know, where does it come back to itself? Right? Where is its identity? Differentiation, that's all over the place. It differentiates itself. That's what the concept is. The question is, how does it, as he says repeatedly in the material that you read for today, it sustains itself, it pervades itself, it remains with itself, it is with itself in and through its own differentiation. How's that last bit? How does it come back to itself? That's the hard part to figure out for Hegel. I'm intentionally flipping the script on that, right? Most often we say, well, the hard part is how do you get difference out of this huge, this is the Adornian critique of Hegel, right? How do you get differentiation out of this huge oneness of being, right? The whole huge oneness of the concept. How is there anything that remains left over outside the concept? And Hegel's like, what do you mean something left over outside the concept? There's nothing left over outside the concept because the concept generates everything. The question is, how does the concept generate everything? All right, sorry, that's coming in attractions more than it is what we've got to write. Is that useful?
No, it is. I feel like I want to ask the follow-up about contradiction, negativity, and relativity, but I won't.
Contradiction is not how Hegel understands the nature of differentiation. It's simple, answer to that. Hippolyte read it that way, and the history of French philosophy vis-a-vis, we don't want to do what Hegel's doing with difference, gets written out of that. Simple answer, not simple thoughts. Much more difficult. All right. So what then is this subjectivity? Right? We normally associate agency with it. It sounds like it's consciousness. It can't be that. So what is it? So we can say, let's start with something that does seem rather sensible. We can say that concept, judgment, and syllogism, right, just are the historical rules of thought, of denken, right? Thought, of thinking. And so we could say, well, the section's title comes from that. These are rules for what it means to think. So we don't have to go all the way to consciousness. We don't have to go all the way to awareness of the world. We can just say, here's how the mind's activity, the rules that govern the mind's activity. But Hegel points to another source for this in his in the polemical remarks, the introductory remarks. I pointed this out last time, I just want to come back to it and use it now as a bridge into the actual discussion. And he says, you know, the subjective logic takes as its model the transcendental logic of Kant. The transcendental logic of Kant. Now, Kant famously distinguishes between three kinds of logic. Three kinds of logic. This, if you want the reference, this is B77 to B82 in the first critique. B77 to B82 in the first critique. He draws a distinction there between what he calls classical formal logic. He calls it pure general logic as well. Classical formal logic. And by that he says, I mean, this is Kant, an a priori discipline that concerns the pure forms or rules of thought as such. So this classical formal logic. Concept, judgment, syllogism. Aristotelian inheritance. But Aristotle didn't create this, he discovered this, right? That's the idea. The second kind of logic that Kant talks about is what he calls applied general logic. Applied general logic. It's an a posteriori science, so we know for Kant this is not at the same stage, same level as an a priori science. It's an a posteriori science that sets forth the rules of the employment of the understanding under subjective, empirical, that is, psychological conditions. That is to say, this is how we tend to reason. It's a descriptive science in that sense, right? It really is, well, you know, if you look around and see what humans are doing, here's what they do. They tend to form concepts. They tend to put concepts together into judgments. We have kind of rules for them doing so. And they're loose and, you know, rough rules, but they're rules. They're inductive generalities, right? That's what they are. And we can get out of that some kind of, put the judgments together and we get some kind of syllogism. So you can talk about these forms under the guise of either classical formal logic, which took them to be a priori rules, universal and necessary, didn't need a mind to do them. It's just the rules for thought itself. Anything that thinks would do this, and must do this. Or you can talk about them as, okay, this is how humans reason. It's a descriptive project largely in that regard. So he distinguishes both the a priori way of thinking about logic and these concept, judgment, syllogism figures or forms, and an applied, so an a posteriori version of that as well. And then he has a third, right? The third is obviously most important for Kant, most important for Hegel. And that's what he calls transcendental logic. Transcendental logic. He calls that an a priori discipline as well. So it's like formal logic, and it's an a priori discipline. Because it lays out the rules, the laws of the employment of the understanding and reason. But here's where it goes one step further, right? The classical general logic, classical formal logic just said, here are the rules for thinking. But transcendental logic says, here's the rules for thinking, here's the rules for the understanding and for reason, as they relate to objects a priori. Not a posteriori, not, well, we were thinking about some objects and here's how we think about them. But here's what it would be to think about objects universally and necessarily prior to there even being objects. These are the rules that would govern the engagement, the employment of the understanding and reason with objects themselves. So Kant famously said, look, I'm not writing a classical formal logic. I'm not writing an implied general logic. I'm writing a transcendental logic. That's what the first critique is. And it's organized under this structure. Concepts, it's the transcendental aesthetic, judgments, transcendental analytic, syllogisms, the dialectic. So to work out a transcendental logic, Kant takes the judgment forms. Doesn't spend a lot of time with the concepts. That's the categories. He just says, we've got these categories and we're good once we got them. Let's get to the judgment forms themselves and start using the judgment forms. That's where he gets quality, quantity, relation, modality. Sorry, quantity, quality, I always do the reverse because, you know, Hegel. Quantity, quality, relation, modality. He takes those up and he says, oh, those are functions of unity. That's what he calls them on B94. Functions of unity. Functions of unity for what? Well, they serve, they're functions of unity. They serve as, famously, the guiding, the leading, Leitfaden clue into the transcendental syntheses. So it's not just how we think about things, it's actually how we bring them about. For Kant, always under the prerequisite of how do we bring them about for us, not as they are in themselves. That we can't know. But as they are for us, they've got to obey those rules, otherwise they cannot be for us. So they're not just clues about how we reason about things, think about things, understand them. It's how we actually, let me use a loaded term here, not Kant's term, constitute them. Constitute them. How we, use another loaded term, construct them. To use Kant's favorite term, how we synthesize them. How we bring them under the unity of a concept, as he says. How we bring them under the unity of a concept, space, time, and the categories. So the transcendental syntheses, the operations of the mysterious power of transcendental apperception, or more properly, transcendental imagination, this crazy, weird thing that goes on, that Kant just says, it's mysterious how it operates, but here's what it does. We can look at it in its result. We can see that it brings everything to be an object and brings all those objects together and make one world. Rather than many worlds, we get one world made up of many different objects within it. And the way that happens is it obeys these particular functions of unity that you can discover in classical formal logic, but now seen as transcendental logic, because it's not just about how we think, it's about how the world actually is, or at least the world for us. The world in itself we can't know. So in B104, in the first critique, Kant famously says, the same function that gives unity to the various representations in a judgment. The same function that gives unity to the various representations in a judgment. So look at the judgment forms. Right? You can see how those operate. Forms of judgment. Those aren't just forms of judgment making. He says, they also give unity to the mere synthesis of various representations in an intuition. So judgment is the clue, right, in the forms thereof. Judgment and the clue is in the forms thereof are the clue to how we actually can spell out, well, what are the conditions of the possibility of objects of experience? Because they're the clues for how we find these forms, the quantity, quality, relation, modality set of categories. So he says, it also gives unity to the mere synthesis of various representations in an intuition, and this unity in its most general expression we entitled the pure concept of the understanding. That's B104 in first critique. So the transcendental logic is thus comprised of a transcendental aesthetic, which is about concepts, really, although he continually, this is always kind of interesting, right? This is telling in a lot of ways. I won't get off on a rant about this, but Kant always says, space and time are not concepts. He repeatedly says that, right? He loves to tell you it's not, because they're not subsumptive, right? They're forms of intuition, he says, right? So they're not abstract concepts, because that's what he thinks a concept is, right? He thinks a concept can only be an empty generality. And he says, that's not what space and time are. They're not empty generality. They are forms of intuition. They're conditions of the possibility of you experiencing anything at all. Everything has to be somewhere in space, somewhere in time, where you can't even have it. So space and time are not concepts. But then he immediately, having said that, right, turns around and says, now the concept of space and the concept of time, immediately starts calling them concepts when he's just told us they're not concepts. Okay, so they're not concepts in the traditional sense, but they're concepts in this framework. They're what's taking the place of conceptuality, right, in the transcendental logic, because that's what we get in the transcendental aesthetic, as he calls it. So we get the materials of thought there, the intuitions, and they're worked on by the conception in the transcendental analytic. These are the forms of judgment now, which sets forth the initial ordering of these materials under the a priori forms of judgment, that is the categories. And you get eventually from that a transcendental dialectic, which is set up on all in terms of syllogisms, because we're trying to move from one thing up to another, up to another, up to another, regressively up to the highest, right? That's the way all the dialectic works. And those give you illusory, right? You get the transcendental shine, you get the illusion of having reached something that's not really there. When you talk about them constitutively, so no God, no freedom, no immortality, constitutive features of the world, they're not there, although these dialectical, syllogistic features will take you there. Worth remembering here, right? For Kant, the first way of thinking about syllogisms is they're illusions, right? They're productive of illusions. Dialectic is productive of illusions. Hegel is well aware of that, and yet still wants to embrace them. Now, Kant will say, this kind of gets lost because we get so freaked out on all the things he wants to say in the antinomies and paralogisms and so forth in the dialectic, that, oh my God, dialectic is always producing shine, it's always producing illusion. That's terrible. Right, it is. But then he spends a whole, appendix telling you, yeah, but if you don't take those constitutively, if you take them regulatively, God, freedom, and immortality, they're true for us, they're not true in themselves, then you can you can have a moral world, and you can make judgments about that moral world in terms of its purposes. Set up for what he does in the second critique. Remember, Kant didn't think he was writing 3 critiques, he thought he was writing 1, so everything was supposed to be in the first one. So you get little glimpses of what was going to be fleshed out in much more detail and what became eventually the second and third critique, already in the first critique. So that little appendix is him saying, well, right, syllogisms are not evil. They're evil when you take them to be disclosive of things as they are in themselves. That's the mistake. You've got to this is always the Kantian corrective, right? Bring to bear the noumenal phenomenal distinction. Once you put that in place, then the safeguards are there to not fall into the trap of illusion, and you can say, oh, God, but not God as in itself, world not as in itself, freedom not as in itself, but as for us, absolutely. It's what's necessary for us to make sense of the world, make sense of ourselves, make sense of morality, make sense of making judgments, make sense of art, make sense of biology, make sense of history, everything else. So that's the way in which transcendental logic operates. And then Hegel writes this. So take a look on page 515 with me. This is pages 18 through 19 in the German. Right at the bottom of page 515. So this is still in the introductory materials. This is still polemical, right? So this is not systematic demonstration. Always worth reminding ourselves, where are we at in the text, right? Is this systematic derivation or is this polemical engagement? Hegel is clearly engaging in polemic here. But the polemic can be useful and insightful. That's all I'm trying to do with it here. So there's a long passage where he's talking about the transcendental logic in Kant. And he begins to compare the work he's going to do in the subjective logic with it. So it's comparative, polemical in that sense. Let's see what he does with it here. So take a look at, this is 18 over to 19 in the German, 515, right, the bottom 4 lines on this explanation. Everybody see where I'm at? Last 4 lines on 515, then over to 16. So I'm just going to quote this fairly lengthy passage. I'm pretty sure I've retranslated some stuff here, so bear with me. Nothing's spectacularly wrong with the translation. It's just a little nuance here and there. On this explanation, he's talking about the transcendental logic in Kant's first critique. On this explanation, the German there is Darstellung. On this presentation, would be a better way of translating that. On this presentation, the unity of the concept is that by virtue of which something is not the determination of mere feeling, is not intuition, or even mere representation, but an object. And this objective unity is the unity of the I with itself. Now that's Hegel's quick and dirty, you want to know what's going on in the first critique? Here's what's going on in the first critique. Right? The transcendental logic is the logic by which objects are constituted as objects. Right? And they're constituted that way for the I, which is itself a unity. The transcendental unity of apperceptions is just invoked. So this is the, as I mentioned last time, the takes one to know one principle. Right? One world, takes one consciousness to know one world. Can't have one world if you don't have one consciousness. So there's got to be unity if there's unity on that side, which there manifestly is for Kant, we have one world. Then there's got to be one consciousness that knows it. But then look at what Hegel does. So that's his summation, quick and down and dirty, of the first critique and the working of the transcendental logic there. But then look at what he does with it, is begins to pick it up and quite honestly transforms it into what he's doing in the subjective logic. He says, in point of fact, it's now on top of 516, the conceptual comprehension, begreifen, right? So there's begreif, the concept. The conceptual comprehension of an object, Gegenstand, not Objekt, Gegenstand, consists in nothing else than in the I, the ego, making it, the object, its own. So eigen. It belongs to it. It appropriates it. In pervading it and bringing it into its own form. That is, into a universality that is immediately determinateness. Now, if you're a Kantian, you're like, maybe that's what Kant was doing? I can kind of see something there. It's not recognizably apostasy yet, right? He hasn't diverged completely from orthodox Kantian view at that point, at least. Doesn't sound like it. He's about to. he says, into a universality that is immediately determinist, or into a determinist which is immediately universality. So this is like, there is no intuition without conceptuality, right? Intuitions are blind without conceptuality. This is the claim, right? Concepts are blind on their own without intuitions. Intuitions are blind without conceptuality. You've got to have both. They've got to be working together. There really is no manifold in Kant. Right? This is the ultimate payoff of that. There is no blind, buzzing confusion of a manifold. There's no sensory manifold like that. Kant always invokes that, but there literally is never an experience of that, right? Why? Because you're always suffused with space-time and the categories. You can't not have those and have an experience. So space-time and the categories are always suffused throughout. Right? So universality is determined throughout in that way. And he says this, as intuited or also as represented, the object, the Gegenstand, is still something external, alien. Now there's the subject-object divide, right? It's still something over there. It's mine, but it's not mine, right? It's met my conditions. It's passed through that categorical framework in order to be something for us. It has to meet the conditions of space-time and the categories. Well, it's done that, so now it can be an object for us, but it's still something other than us. It's not, it hasn't become pure Berkeleyan idealism. It hasn't become something within us. He says, what is conceptualized? Greifen, concept. The being in and for itself that it has an intuition representation is transformed into a positedness, Gesetzsein. Now look, Kant will have none of that. Right? There's the apostasy. Kant can have none of that. Why? Because what he just said is, for that thing to be at all, is to be constituted in accordance with those concepts. It is nothing other than what's constituted by those concepts. And you know that Kant always said, well, the object in itself, as he always says in the first critique, equals X. Right? We don't know what it is, undetermined, unknown, but it's nominally possible. We can think it's there, but we can't know that if it has any determinations. So all this stuff we do in the first critique, space-time and the categories, they're only applicable to things as they are phenomenally, as they are for us, not as they are nominally, things as we can think them in themselves. But Hegel's saying, well, actually there is no object without that conceptual process going on, so it's positing them. This is his Fichtean inflection, right? His Fichtean inflection of the Kantian project. Clearly, he's pushing a Fichtean line here that, violates the letter, but as a good Fichtean would say, not the spirit, right? But the letter, Kantians would say the spirit too, of what's going on in Kant. So he pushes this one step further now. In thinking it, now just in thinking it, not in intuition, not in representation, just in thinking it, in thinking object, the I pervades it. But it is only in thought that it is in and for itself. As it is in intuition representation, it is in appearance. Thought sublates the immediacy with which it, the object, first comes before us, and in this way transforms the object into a positiveness. It constitutes it. It brings it about. It is what it is by virtue of this. It creates it. But this, its positiveness, is its being in and for itself, or its objectivity. This is an objectivity that the object consequently attains in the concept, and this concept is the unity of self-consciousness. There's the unity of, transcendental unity of apperception, but this is not Kant anymore, right? This is at best Fichte. Into which that object has been assumed or taken over. Consequently, its objectivity or the concept itself, the concept is itself none other than the nature of self-consciousness, and it, objectivity, has no other moments or determinations than the I itself. Now that long passage, right, is clearly Hegel saying, what I'm about to do here is like the transcendental logic, the project of the transcendental logic that Kant was pursuing in the first critique. So the subjective logic is like that in some sense. And you might step back from that and go, oh, well now subjectivity makes sense. Because the subjectivity is not going to be my personal interiority subjectivity. It's not going to be moral agency subjectivity, but it's going to be like transcendental ego subjectivity. It's going to be like that. It's going to be like the transcendental I. It's going to be like transcendental unity of apperception. In a very Fichtean, active, positing sense, but okay. But it's going to be like early Fichte. It's going to be like that. Note two things here that that Hegel's doing, and then we'll see where this can take you and then where it takes him. The first thing he's saying is that objectivity, something's being in and for itself. Right? He says objectivity is positiveness. So Hegel, again along with Fichte here, is contending that if the unity of an object is the result, the product of the synthetic activity of the ego, the I, then the totality of the objects that comprise the world as such, not just objects as they appear, but objects as such. That's all we can talk about now, because what other objects are there? What other objects could there be? Is constituted in and through the activity that Kant defined as the I. That is the activity of synthesis, the synthetic unity of apperception, self-consciousness, or just simply the imagination. But that would mean then that the concept is the truth of things. It is truth. It is ultimately the true nature of all things. There is no noumenal realm beyond it. This is Hegel clearly reading the project of the transcendental logic through a Fichtean vein, through a Fichtean lens, and pushing out the other end of it, saying that means that objectivity is the result of the processes of synthetic processes of the transcendental unity of apperception, the transcendental imagination. So it's positive. And the second thing and I'll come back and talk about that more. The second thing he talks about here is what he calls the fluidity of logic. This is a point that he's already made in the introduction or the preface to the subjective logic, where he's talked about, we have this dead bones of the classical formal logic, and we need to enliven them, right? We need to see how they actually flow into one another. This is also part of his standard criticism of Kant, where he wants to say, look, Kant all the time is telling us about the wonders of formal logic, but he always just takes them over wholesale, right? He just sweeps them up, right? He swept them up from the history. This is the image that Hegel always uses as a critique of Kant, where he just takes over wholesale these quantity, quality, relation modality categories and just brings them all over wholesale into his philosophy without ever taking the time to show how one entails the next and demonstrates how each one is absolutely necessarily required, which of course is what the objective logic did, because it's about, let's reverse them, quality, quantity, relation, both in the essential and absolute sense of relation, and modality. That's exactly what the objective logic really turned out to be. In one sense, was an unpacking of those categories and how they flow into one another. So he talks about the fluidity of logic. So the forms of classical logic, the forms of the concept, judgment, and syllogism, are the clues to the structure of the process whereby all things are constituted. So there's something, Kant was onto something there. And Hegel's about to take up that same insight. Something's right there. But the restriction that Kant puts on it, that this is just about how things as they appear for us, that's illicit. That's not warranted. So we must show then how these forms necessarily flow into one another. We must show how concept necessarily entails judgment, how judgment in all of its forms necessarily entails syllogism in all of its plethora of forms. Only in that way can the movement that they seek to articulate be thought in accordance with what is truth. So it turns out that truth is not only the concept, but the movement of the concept is what truth is. Now, here's one of the most puzzling parts of the subjective logic. We're going to think about truth, and what we mean by truth here is not propositional truth. We don't mean truth in the sense of, here's a state of affairs, and I've made a judgment, it's either true or not about that state of affairs. Does my statement correspond to the state of affairs? That's not the kind of truth we're fundamentally talking about here. That's a fine thing to talk about. Hegel's not against it. It's just not what's at issue here. The truth he's talking about here is what Heidegger in his essay on the essence of truth calls material truth. Material truth. That is, not the correspondence of things with judgment, but of things with their concepts. Well, this is the world accords with the concept. So that's the sense of truth we're talking about here. So Hegel defines the project of the subjective logic here. This is on 522, 5 lines from the top, so take a look on 522 with me. Here's his own characterization of what are you doing in the subjective logic, right? And it's kind of crazy, right? It's kind of nuts, but in its ambition. Look at what he says here. There is, look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top of page 522. This is page 24 in the German. There is a second side left to which this third book of the logic is devoted. And so here's, you want to know what this third book is doing? You want to know what the subjective logic is doing? Here's what it's doing. Here's this short version of what's going on in the subjective logic. Namely, the demonstration of how the concept forms within and from itself the reality that has vanished in it. Now, when you first read that, you go, I'm sorry, where was the vanishing? What's the forming out of what? Right? You should be pretty perplexed about what's being said. But let's parse it this way. Right? He's saying at least this. He's saying the demonstration, here's what this third book is trying to do. It's giving you a demonstration of how the concept, this process as we know concept at least denotes this constitutive process, this generative process. Okay. What does it do? Forms, so that's the term for creates, produces, forms, within and from itself, not using something else, but literally from itself and itself alone, immanently. Right? So it doesn't apply itself to some pre-given material, right? Not the sensible manifold as we hear in Kant. There's nothing outside of the concept, literally nothing outside of the concept. So the concept generates from within and out of itself. The reality is the term, I think, for everything that we talked about in the objective logic. So being, in broad terms, what did being turn out to be? Being turned out to be essence, turned out to be actuality, turned out to be this process of manifestation. That's what it turned out to be. Well, he's saying, well, this is how the concept generates all that. Then he says, the reality that has vanished in it is in the concept. Well, that vanished in it is what we read in that last paragraph. It all falls back now, right? We retrogress into the ground, right? We go back in going forward. So we go forward into what? From manifestation, from actuality, to what? From necessity to what? To this movement of the concept, freedom. So everything is vanished into the concept. The truth of being is essence, the truth of essence is concept. So that's where we're at. So what are we trying to show? How all that came out of the concept. And you want to say at that point, do you mean to tell me that the objective logic is an account of the relational structure of the nature of reality? Absolutely is. And that relational structure entails a processional generative activity that gives rise to it. Yeah. So what's the subjective logic supposed to do? Show how the relations came out of that process. Show how the relations, how the world was engendered by that process. The world that we call being in essence and looked at in terms of its quantity, relation, modality, all that stuff, how all that's generated out of the concept itself. Well, the only way we can do that is to show what's the logic of the concept itself. Not infer it through relationality, but see it for what it is on its own terms. So that's the first project. Then we can give an account of how that engenders, let me use broad terms, reality. The other broad term I'd use for it is the world, everything that exists. I would suggest that that's what the objectivity chapter is supposed to do. So the objectivity chapter, and please, we'll see when we get there whether this works or not. I've been through this many times trying to see if this works. I think it does, but let's test it out. It's a hypothesis. I think the objectivity chapter is supposed to be, whether it's successful or not, it's another matter, supposed to be an account of, okay, here's the nature of reality. We gave it relationally in the logic of being and the logic of essence. Here's its processional account in the logic of the concept. That's what, as we'll see, the mechanism, chemism, and teleology are really supposed to be. They're the processes that entail the relations that we see in quantity, quality, relation, modality.
Yeah.
All right. Yes, sorry. Let me hear.
So why the order of the book, not the reverse? Why not the subjective logic?
Because we don't start with the foundation, because the foundation is not warranted into itself. Right? I mean, that's the short answer, right? We have to demonstrate, we have to justify that the world is the result of a process. And we haven't been able to justify that until we've shown that there is no relations of the essential sort without there being something that manifests itself in them and engenders those relations. And then that was the key move to say, okay, so the relationality of the world is generated by a process that's not reducible to that relational logic alone. It generates that relational structure, but it's not reducible to that relational structure alone. Then and only then are we talking about something that is deeper than either being or essence, but is the truth of both. That's the concept. So only now can we really talk about what's the logic of that thing and that process into itself. Now, you're right. You'd say, well, the order of demonstration is reversed from the order of being, right? The fundamental order of being is the concept comes first, everything else follows from it. That's absolutely true. But that's why we regress into the ground for Hegel. Because you're not entitled, this is the epistemic problem, you're not entitled to say the concept is everything, which is where the book ends. That's the end of the, no big surprise, right? That's the end of the logic as a whole. The concept is literally everything. I take that to be the summary declaration thesis of the book. But you're not entitled to that by just asserting it. That would be the height of dogmatism. You're entitled to it because you've been able to demonstrate it, because it's necessarily entailed by the relational structure, the relational fabric of the nature of reality. So, but you had to show what that you had to show that it had the relational structure, then it entails this. This all seems easy once you've gotten here, but it's established, demonstrated only by going through those demonstrations, only by going through those arguments. Is that useful?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. That's a good question. Other questions? All right, so let me come back to this comparison then. So that's his claim for what the project of the subjective logic is. So concept forms, judgment forms, and the figures of the syllogism are thus all structures that lay out the rules that govern the movement that is the concept itself. They are the determinations, we could say the principles of thought, whereby being and essence are constituted. So at that point, we could say, so now let's come back to this subjectivity question. We could say, couldn't we, from those remarks, that the fundamental project of the subjective logic, perhaps of the whole science of logic itself, is the demonstration that the various moments of being and essence are actually moments in the autonomous process of self-consciousness. So that's what he's calling this. That's why this is a subjective logic. It really is, at the end, an idealism in the kind of Kantian, transcendental idealism. It's not the same, but Fichtean inheritance idealism, it's really about that. It's a demonstration that the various moments of being and essence are actually moments in the autonomous process of self-consciousness, that the determinations of being and essence are actually, this is one way of thinking about what Hegel shows, the determinations that objects must have, not as they are in themselves, but must have, as they appear and as they appear to and for a consciousness that is fundamentally self-consciousness. So it looks like if you just took this up and you said, well, that's not orthodox Kant, no one's claiming that, but it's Kantian in lineage. Why? Because the concept really turns out to be just Hegel's version of the transcendental unity of apperception. And so when we're talking about the subjective logic, subjectivity here means not moral agency or interiority, those kinds of forms of subjectivity. It's the subjectivity of the transcendental ego or transcendental unity of apperception, something roughly like that. That's why this is that. And as I mentioned last time, and I highly, highly recommend it to you, Robert Pippin wrote an entire book about that, right? Hegel's idealism is a fantastic demonstration of that project in precisely that way. That is his claim. That is his absolute core claim, is that the concept just is apperception, right? It is the principle of unity of transcendental apperception, synthetic apperception, and it is a kind of what I would call Fichtean inflected way of reading Hegel and reading the logic. And it really does say, well, what's going on in all those categories in the objective logic is to say, oh, in order for objects to be objects for self-consciousness, they have to have these particular categories of determination: substance, accident, cause, effect, necessity, possibility, all the various determinations, quantity, quality, all that stuff. All those determinations, it has to have those in order to be for self-consciousness. That's the way of reading this as a project in line with and in the lineage of, and didn't Hegel just give us a lot of reason to think this in the heritage of Kant? So the subjective logic is subjective on that reading because it's the articulation of the subjectivity to which all objects, insofar as they are knowable, are related and to which they must appear. So that's the way of reading the subjective logic as subjective.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, the subjective logic is subjected on that reading because it is the articulation of the subjectivity to which all objects, insofar as they are knowable, are related and to which they thus must appear. So, everything has to be pulled back to the apperceptive nature of consciousness, the self-conscious nature of consciousness. Leibniz was right, is a way of putting that we can't be aware of anything. We're not blank slates, right? So this is famously Leibniz's response to Locke. Locke said we're all just tabula rasa, waiting for experience to write on us. And Leibniz picks up on that metaphor and says, not exactly. Right? We're not blank slates. The slates have markings within them, have structure within them already. This is the genesis of the Kantian problematic in a lot of ways. This is in his, what's it called, the new essays on Leibniz's new essays. It's his response, the only rationalist response to an empiricist, right? It's pretty brilliant. Leibniz goes through and says, here's what Locke is claiming, that we're all just blank slates. We're not blank slates. The slates have structure. And part of that structure is these petite perceptions, these little perceptions, that we're aware of ourselves. Apperception, that we perceive, but we also perceive ourselves along with perception. So we're not a blank slate. We're always already accompanying. This is the I think must be able to accompany all my representations at Kant. So here it all is. It all comes home, right? And this is the way of reading what's going on here. So the subjective logic is Hegel's elaboration of that apperceptive structure. The only problem with that, you knew there was going to be a problem. The only problem with that is that that's not how Hegel does it. You can mine all this and read it that way, and I think there's good grounds and profitable grounds to read it that way, but it's not how Hegel does it, and I think you also miss some stuff when you read it that way. You risk, just to put it very bluntly, you risk reinserting the subject-object divide when Hegel has said that's got to be abandoned. It hasn't been justified. You just sort of reassert, consciousness is apperceptive, so here we go. I haven't demonstrated that one bit. You just asserted it. So there is a way of doing a systematic, non-metaphysical, to use the hermeneutic paradigms I was talking about earlier. This is sort of the paradigmatic, iconic, emblematic way of doing this, of doing a systematic but non-metaphysical reading of the science of logic. But it's predicated on polemical grounds. Remember, this is polemic from Hegel. Right? This is not Hegel saying, I've systematically shown that the transcendental logic entails the speculative logic of the science of logic. It's not what he does. It's predicated on polemical grounds rather than systematic grounds, and that's confirmed because Hegel actually doesn't appeal to understanding the concept in terms of the synthetic unity of apperception as the organizing principle of the subjective logic. Never once. Never once in the actual systematic account of the concept does he say, and this is self-consciousness, or this is apperception. None of that. Here, yes, because it's polemic. He's saying, well, it's like this. It could be, you could read it in this vein, but look, you're going to have to tear it up you're going to have to be pretty unorthodox with it. You're going to have to be pretty Fichtean with it, and we all know Kant wouldn't have abided that, didn't abide that. We all know that Fichte, switched about this later in his philosophy as well. So how does Hegel actually organize the discussion of what's going on in the subjective logic, and why does he pick the term subjective then? He appeals to the concept of truth. He keeps going back to it. So, I apologize. I know this is about to sound, wildly Heideggerian, but I think it's just true of the two books. The objective logic is answering the question, what is being? The subjective logic is answering the question, what is truth? So yes, you can put the two together, and the science of logic is a book about the truth of being, which is terribly Heideggerian, but it's actually pretty close to what, if not exactly what, Hegel says, because this is the way he puts it. He says this is on 526. So here now in the division, now we're moving into the systematic elaboration, not just the polemical stuff. 526, the first 5 lines on page 526, 29 in the German. He says the concept is considered so far. So now up to the end of the objective logic, because that's now we're starting the subjective logic proper, not doing the polemical introductory stuff, the historical references and all that. You can set that aside. So the concept as considered so far has demonstrated itself to be what? The unity of being in essence. Standard Hegel's, like 101 Hegel's, like how do you define something? By what's entailed it, right? What was this genesis? Where did it come from? How did you, and what is it, how was it entailed? Right? So this is his, reminder of, don't you see this? The concept is the sequel, right? The necessary third to being in essence. He writes, essence is the first negation of being. We saw that. We worked hard on that, trying to understand that transition. But that's essence, right? Reflects itself out of being. There's the first negation of being, which has thereby become shine. That's S-C-H-E-I-N, shine, illusion, right? We were just talking about his illusion. In Kant, it's not illusion in Hegel, right? It means the surface of things. Then he says, and that's all he really says about the logic of essence, becomes shine. Then he says, the concept is the second negation. So he's doing macro level demonstrations. Let's remind ourselves the arc of this argument I've been unpacking. The concept is a second negation, or the negation of the negation, and is therefore restored again being. So we haven't lost being, right? It hasn't gone away. We don't, being, that was so stupid. Why were we talking about essence? That was idiotic. Why were we talking about? No, those things are still retained. There's not retained in their supremacy. Now we know what, to put it in a Kantian formulation, makes them possible. To put it in Hegel's formulation, we know the truth of them. He says, is therefore restored again being, but as in itself the infinite mediation and negation of being. So the concept is the unity of being in essence. That means it's the negation of being, but that retains being within it. So being is going to be a moment of this concept in some form, fashion, or another. But then look at what he does. This is still on 526. This is the end of that first paragraph. So same paragraph, but look at the end of that. He says, this is right in the middle of that paragraph. The concept is the truth of the substantial relation. Everybody see where I'm at? So notice, when you ask Hegel, what's the project here? He doesn't say, it's all about self-consciousness. We finally got to apperception. That's why we're doing subjectivity now. What he says, it's about truth. He formulates this in terms of a truth problematic. So look at what he does here. The concept is the truth of the substantial relation in which being and essence attain their complete self-subsistence and determination through one another. So there's the unity, but now it's the truth of them, right? So what's the concept? It's the truth of being in essence. It's where they attain their complete self-subsistence and determination through one another. Then again, the truth of substantiality proved to be the substantial identity, which equally is and only is as positiveness. So there's that language again of positiveness. But now it's not the doing of transcendental unity of apperception, it's just the creating of something. Well, what's doing the creating? Well, we know there's this process that's doing this creating. But that process is not the transcendental unity of apperception's work. He says, positiveness is existence, Dasein, that's in being, right, the logic of being. And differentiation, Unterscheidung, so that's in essence. So he's saying, it's what makes all that stuff work. Being in and for itself has therefore attained in the concept a true and measured existence for that positiveness is itself being in and for itself. This positiveness constitutes the difference of the concept in the concept itself. Its differences, because the concept is immediately being in and for itself, are themselves the whole concept in their universal determinateness and identical with their negation. Now that's pretty convoluted language for Hegel to say, look, what we're going to be talking about here is not something separate that we've already been grappling and dealing with. It's about being, it's about essence, it's about what engenders them, it's about what creates them, yes. But it's about how it operates. It's about how it creates the differences, creates the forms of existence that are to be found in the logic of being, to be found in the logic of essence. That's what the whole concept will be. So positiveness, Gesetzsein, is the movement of constitution that is manifestation, we could say. We can identify those terms. And Hegel's claim here is that the differences that define the concept, those differences are universality, particularity, singularity, are as such the differences intrinsic to, they're immanent to this process itself. The concept is the substantial identity, namely the reciprocity, that proved to be the truth of substantiality. But then he says, look in the next paragraph, you always want to, Hegel has this way of writing where he reaches a crescendo, right? That's what just happened, right? It's everything, right? It's one way, very curt, brutal way of summarizing, paraphrasing what he's saying. The concept's just like, it's everything, right? It's not throwing anything away. It's everything we've been talking about, but now we get to see how all that stuff gets to be. It's everything. Then he says this. This is now the concept itself of the concept. Okay, now we've got the concept of the concept. So now we know what we're talking about roughly, right? It's some kind of generative process, some kind of generative movement that has these three moments, universality, particularity, singularity. Great, thank you. But then look at what he says. But at first, only the concept of the concept, or also itself only concept. Now that should take you aback, right? Because we just reached this crescendo where the concept is everything, but now he's saying, well, at first, in this first chapter, the subjectivity chapter, it ain't everything yet. It ain't all I just said it's cracked up to be just yet. He says, he puts in place this restriction, right? Considered so far, he says. Only at first, he says. Why? Because as a substantial identity of reciprocal causality, causation, active substance itself, the concept has not yet posited its own moments. We've seen them asserted, right? We've seen, well, there's universality here, there's particularization going on here, there's individuality here. We can see those three moments. But it hasn't actually been demonstrated from within it, how those work. They've just been asserted to be there, right? That's how the objective logic ends. There's this moment of passive substance, this moment which is the cause. There's this moment of active substance, which is the effect. And there's a moment of causation itself, which is what brings about both of the other two moments. But what we realize is, that's universality is the cause, singularity is the effect, and differentiation or particularization is the causal process itself. We've named those now. We've been able to isolate those moments, but we haven't seen how one gives rise to the other. We haven't actually elaborated that logic, that transformative logic itself. So he says, the concept is only the truth in itself or implicitly. Look down at the paragraph at the bottom of 526, it's right before 30 in the German. At first, therefore, the concept is only implicitly the truth. So there's the measure, right? It's not everything, it's not the truth. It's not the concept fully in being. The concept fully objective. It's not that. It's the concept only implicitly in itself. He says, at first, therefore, the concept is only implicitly the truth. It's not yet been rendered explicitly the truth. We haven't shown it's to use the term I was using a moment ago, that it's fully the truth of being. Because it is only something inner. In what? In itself. It hasn't shown what it produces yet. We're only to if you want to put it this way, we've reached the process, and now we're talking about the process on its own terms, but we have not yet seen how the process generates or creates the world. We've entailed that, right? We've been forced back to this and said, here's what we've got to come to. And now we're going to spell out its internal logic. But its internal logic is what's inner to it. That will still be implicit. That will still be formal. It is equally only something outer. That's what he means by that, right? It's not yet been shown to be in the world. It's outside the world at this point. It is at first simply an immediate, and in this shape, its moments have the form of immediate, fixed determinations. It appears as the determinate concept, as a sphere of mere understanding. Because this form of immediacy is in existence still inadequate to the nature of the concept. There's the material truth language, right? Inadequate to the nature of the concept. For the concept is free and only refers to itself. It is an external form in which the concept does not exist in and for itself, does not yet exist in and for itself, but can only count as something posited or subjective. Now, what I would recommend is that you take that sentence to be definitive of what he means by subjectivity in this book. He doesn't mean by it agency, right? He's just told you what I mean by it is something that's not yet been proven to be objective, not yet been shown to be the world. That's going to be the truth, right? That's what we're going to argue. That's what we're going to have to show. That's the task of the subjective logic to court as a whole. But in this first chapter, when we're talking about the subjectivity of the process, we don't mean the interiority of it. We don't mean that it's some personal kind of thing. We don't mean it's even transcendental unity of our perception. Wonderful as all that is. What we mean is just something very basic and simple. This, that it's not yet the world. Hasn't been shown to be that. So it's formal, it's external, it's inner to itself. So it is only subjective in that sense. That's how he's using subjective. Subjective denotes here its limitedness because it's not yet been shown to be objective. It's not yet been shown to be the world itself. The world's entailed it, right? The nature of reality has entailed this, but we haven't shown how it generates the world from itself. Remember, that's the project. We got to show how reality is formed in and out of this process that it has vanished into. Right now, we're just submerged in the process, right? We're going to learn what the process is unto itself, and the way to do that is to look at the formal logic clue to see that. And then the key is to see how that crazily, but necessarily, engenders, creates, constitutes the world out of itself. Right. Let me take this just a little bit further just to reestablish this point, then we'll take a break. Yeah, please, Amir.
But how do we name things we studied in the objective logic without studying generativeness? Is it only thanks to the imaginative synthesis?
Say that again. How do we name? How do we study?
How do we study the things we study in the
Yeah.
objective logic
Yeah.
without considering their generativeness?
Yeah. So we did. We were forced to. But
But why? Why that force?
why were we forced to?
Yes.
Because the only way we could account for how things related was to say, well, ultimately they relate because there's an activity that engenders both of the relata that creates the relation. So whether we're talking about quality, quantity, measure, whether we're talking about essence and existence, and all the variations of that essential relation that we can talk about, the thing and properties and so forth, all of those entail that ultimately those relata are moments of relations that were engendered by something that's not equivalent to those relations themselves. So the process each time. So we first named it as becoming. We then named it as transformation. We then named it as reflection. We then named it as ultimately this expressing and manifestation. Then ultimately this substantiality, this power. All those are names for that activity. But those are names that are inferred from relationality itself. So the generative processes entail, let me flip it around the other way. The relational nature of reality entails the generative process, but can't account for the generative process on its own terms. It can always give a relational account of it, but never a generative account on its own terms. That's why we're here. That's why we've reached a domain, a thought space, if you want to put it in those terms, a logical thought space of now we just got to talk about this becoming, this flow on its own terms, right? And that's what the terms of term logic, the formal logic can give to us. They can give us the flow, the account of the flow itself, because the flow is not arbitrary. It's rule governed, it has a rationality to it, has a logic to it, a logos to it. So we ought to be able to give that account, and that's what this is. But the caveats, right, what he's talking about here, why that's still just implicit, not yet in and for itself, is that we haven't seen how the world comes up out of that. We haven't shown how the world is engendered by that process. We're just showing what the process is on its own terms. So this is, you might say, I'm pushing language here that's not Hegel's at that point, so let me be clear about what I'm about to say. But I think there's a rough parallel to say there's something like a gap at that point, right? Like we're just talking about the process, if that's what's going on. If we just look at this first chapter, these first 3 chapters under the section of subjectivity, and we look at concept, judgment, and syllogism, and we say, what's the point of all that? And we say, well, that's the way the generative process works. You'll say, oh, great. Now, how does that process, given those rules, following those rules, how does it actually give rise to? How is the reality formed out of it? How does it create the world? There's the gap. We don't have that yet. And that's why this is only subjective. Right? Not subjective in the sense of it belongs only to the person, but it's subjective in the sense that it's only formal, it's only external, it's only inner. It's limited because it's not yet objective. Does that help?
Yeah, is it thanks to that gap that...
So the gap between the subjective,
the
right,
relation
to the flow, but we haven't gotten to
between
where the world is.
subjectivity
Sorry, I
and
interrupted.
Is it thanks to that gap that the relation between objectivity and subjectivity does not form a closed circle? And is that gap a temporal or ontological?
Right, so right now it's a logical gap,
Logical.
right? It's neither temporal nor, what was the other?
Ontological.
Ontological, yeah, it's none of those. It's the way I read these caveats he's putting in place here. By saying, look, the concept is everything. That's the first paragraph on 526. The concept's literally everything. It's the truth, right? But then he says, but we're going to treat it initially in terms of its implicitness. You go, what's implicit about the truth? Well, it's structure. Before, logically, not temporally. Logically before, we've been able to show how it is literally engendered the entirety of the world. So that's what we've got so far. And we've got to show how that necessarily entails objectivity of itself. Objectivity doesn't come from someplace else. It comes out of that process. So we've got to show, this will be one of the, we've been through a lot of hard transitions. There will be a hard transition, obviously, at the end of the subjectivity chapter to show, oh, syllogisms entail objectivity. Sorry, how does that work? How do we go from a thought form, syllogisms, to a world form? Mechanism, chemism, that seems a lot. That seems to be jumping over a gap that is too far to cross. But Hegel's claim is that no, that's exactly what it is that movement exactly. But that's where this caveat, this restriction is unbounded at that point. It's taken away, as I see it. But that's the demonstration. It's not just the incision. Is that useful?
Yes, thank you.
Other people want to comment on this? This is an incredibly important aspect, so important to take this. All right, then let me just finish this out and then we'll take a break. So he says, this is still on 526, 5 lines up from the bottom where I was just reading, right? He says there that the concept here is an immediate, whose moments have the form of immediate fixed determinations. So in that status, he says that the concept is inadequate to the nature of the concept. It's a weird claim, right? The concept isn't yet fully what it is. It's inadequate to itself. It's not yet completely what it really is. He's just said it's everything. Well, it's not everything yet. So he says, it's an external form in which the concept does not exist in and for itself, but can only count as something positive. Something positive. Or subjective. He calls this a formal conception of the concept. A formal conception of the concept. He calls it that on 527, yeah. This stage constitutes, therefore, subjectivity, or the formal concept. Its externality is manifested in the fixed being of its determinations that make them come up each by itself, isolated and qualitative, and each only externally referred to the other. But the identity of the concept, which is precisely this inner or subjective essence, sets them in dialectical movement. We're going to see this, right? Hegel constantly comes back to this and says, look, you could stop at this moment and isolate each one of these moments. Right? He says this about individuality. He says individuality is the moment where you lose this flow. You could rigidify and say individuality is over here, particularization is here, universality is over here. They're related, but they're distinct from one another. So we can talk about the this at that point. Aristotle's toe to tee. This thing that's this, right? Can we talk about Socrates, right? There's no science of the individual. That's famous Aristotle claim, right? All you can talk about is universality particularizing itself, but you don't know what it particularizes itself into. That's the this. But that's the rigidification of them. That's the objectify, and you can do that. And Hegel calls that the loss of the concept. You can do it. You can formalize, right? You can objectify in that sense. You can rigidify, focus on the moments as distinct from one another, which is what he's saying. They can be fixed determinations. And this is what we oftentimes do. This is what the understanding is really good at doing, is fixing on things and seeing how they're related, but they're distinct from one another. But the whole point of the argument is to show how, no, they aren't just related. They actually flow into one another. There is no such thing as universality without particularization. There's no particularization without individuality. There's no individualization without the other two. They don't come separate from one another. They don't bear relations to one another. They are moments of the same thing. That's why he will also say individuality is not only the loss of the concept, it's the completion of the concept. So both those at the same time. So the systematic as opposed to the polemical sense of subjectivity is not the original synthetic unity of apperception, I would say. That's not how he's using the term subjective here. But the form of the concept that is extrinsic to and thus inadequate to the concept itself. It's the implicit truth, not yet the full-born, complete truth unto itself, which we'll get in the idea at the end of the subjective logic. So to talk then in this way is to talk about material truth, right? Not propositional truth, but material truth. And it's what he means when he says that we have, eventually in this account, we will get objectivity as fully, adequately, completely embodying, identical with the concept. Once you get that, but only once you get that, you don't get that in the first chapter, because you don't even have objectivity on the table. But once you get that, and only when you get that, do you have what he calls now no longer the concept, but the concept fully embodied. That's his definition of the idea, which is the concept now full truth. So truth is thus the movement of the concept that engenders both essence and being, and it is that problem, what is material truth, what is truth, that is the systematic principle of organization, I would say, for the subjective logic. All right, enough for a little bit. Let's take a 10-minute break, 4:45, see you back at 4:55, and we'll proceed on from there, look at the division, and then on into universality, particularity, and individuality.